Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here with John Cassidy, who is at the New Yorker magazine, also the author of a bunch of books. Most recent book is this one called Capitalism and Its Critics, a history from the Industrial Revolution to AI, preceded by this one. And I remember when this came out, I think it was in 2009 or so, right? I mean, fresh after the financial crisis, called How Markets Fail, the Logic of Economic Calamities. And there's actually, I think, an excerpt from this in the New Yorker that I continue to assign to my students in my behavioral finance class. And then there's a first book of yours called .con, about the .com bubble and its collapse. Welcome, John.
Thank you very much for inviting me on, Greg. Appreciate it.
It seems like there's a theme going through all three of these books about the kind of, I don't know, foibles and pitfalls of capitalism. And this book right here, I mean, this is really comprehensive. I think there's a list of about, I don't know, 25, 30 different critics of capitalism, not including the ones that don't get their own chapter, because you also reference quite a few others in each of the chapters. And I think you said somewhere in the book that the original intent of the book was not to be so encyclopedic, but once you started digging, you realized that these critics of capitalism come in all sorts of forms and shapes and have different perspectives and arguments. And they even include people who you would normally think of as, I don't know, prophets of capitalism, like Adam Smith. And so it seems like just about anybody can find something to criticize in that thing which is loosely referred to as capitalism. So maybe you could tell us just a bit about, what inspired this book and the extent to which it kind of is building on a theme that you've been addressing your whole career.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess I'd go back to the beginning. As a student, I studied economic history with a very famous British historian called Nick Crafts.
Oh, yeah.
And I started out as a sort of academic, and then I went into journalism, so I sort of defrocked academic. And I've been covering basically finance and economics since the 80s now. One of my first big stories was the stock market crash in 87. So I basically had very good publications. I've been in the New York for 30 years now. I've had a sort of front row seat on sort of economic financial history for the last 30 or 40 years. And as you say, my first two books were both about sort of economic crises, the dot-com boom and bust in the late 90s, early O's, and then the great financial crisis in 2007 to 2009. The first book was pretty much a pretty straight sort of narrative history of the rise and fall of the dot-com boom. The second book was more sort of intellectual. It was really a sort of history of free market ideas and sort of debates that had given rise to the financial crisis and the sort of counter views which had arisen inside economics. Talked about behavioral economics. I did chapters on behavioral economics there. And that was, I think, if you look back now, I guess the great financial crisis was sort of when behavioral finance came of age, because it was very difficult to sort of sustain the idea that markets were perfectly rational, and the efficient markets, the hypothesis, took a huge blow in the great financial crisis. So there were two books. I feel like I sort of started out with a microscope zooming in on the dot-com boom, and then I did a history of the financial sector and financial economics really in the other book. And this is really a sort of history of capitalism and economics in general. And the reason the idea for the book basically came about a decade ago, and getting on for a decade now anyway, in 2016, when Trump was running for the Republican nomination and Bernie Sanders was running for the Democratic nomination. And I thought, if you go back into history, it's a long time since we've had sort of major candidates running for office as critics of capitalism from the right and the left. Bernie, of course, has always been a critic of capitalism. He's an independent socialist. I'd call him a social democrat, but we can get into what those terms mean if you want. But what's really new was Trump running from the right with a critic. People have sort of forgotten now, but when he started out, he was criticizing the banks. He was criticizing big businesses for offshoring. He was running with a critique of capitalism from the right. So that got me thinking about, maybe there's a book in how we got here. How can America sort of world capital of capitalism, and always very supportive of the system, come to this state of affairs where the two major candidates are running against it, basically. And I thought originally it would be a shorter book, going back to the sort of roots of the end of the Cold War and what's happened since then, because a lot of the debates obviously go back to that and the sort of period of triumphalism we had in the early 90s. But then when I started that, I realized, well, then you have to explain how you got to the early 90s, where did neoliberalism come from, etc. Then you have to go back into Keynesianism, and where did Keynesianism come from? And I eventually decided, look, what the hell, why not just do the whole thing from the start? And I decided to go back to the Industrial Revolution. So that was the sort of narrative frame I had in my head. And then the other idea, I wanted to do it through the sort of biographies and critics rather than just sort of standard history. Because, I think obviously, are lots of histories of capitalism. Some of them are very good, but I think it's hard to get a general reader to sit down and sort of, start reading just about Standard Oil and the rise of the sort of the Seven Sisters oil companies or whatever. That's quite sort of dense stuff, I think, even for sort of business student. But one of the things I've learned at the New Yorker, if you want to tell a story, put some people in it. And there's always been these fascinating critics of capitalism going back to the beginnings. And as I said, I also have some people in there who are not usually classified as critics of capitalism, like Adam Smith and Milton Friedman. I can explain why they're in there if you want. But that's the sort of shtick of the book. It's an attempt to tell the history of capitalism through the eyes of its critics. Some of them were, revolutionary critics of capitalism, people like Karl Marx and Rosa Luxemburg, some of whom were basically liberals, like Keynes, and some who were somewhere in between. So that's the sort of frame of the book. And you say that there's 28 chapters. Most of them are devoted to one individual. And I tried to, 28 sounds a lot, but if you're telling a history of the last 250 years, it's actually not a lot. So there are a lot of some obvious figure, what people might think obvious figures who are not in there. So it's not meant to be, even though it's long, it's not meant to be comprehensive. It's my sort of version told through some very well-known figures, and I wanted some more lesser well-known figures in there as well, because it's more interesting for the reader, I think, when they discover things and not people they already think they know about. So that's the sort of framework of the book. And it does give you, whatever else, which weaknesses may be, it does give you a history of capitalism, going back to sort of mercantile capitalism and colonial capitalism, whatever, the East India Company and slavery, etc., through the Industrial Revolution, the rise of industrial Britain, the spreading out. The story of the last 200 years is basically the story of industrial capitalism spreading out, first from Britain across the Atlantic to the US and obviously to Germany and France, and then the 20th century expanding throughout most of the rest of the world in the sort of decolonization movements as well. And then in its moment of triumph at the end of the century, going completely global, obviously, when the Soviet Union collapses and China decides to join the world capitalist system as well. And then that produces the backlash, which we're seeing in the 21st century. So I bring you up to date and have a final chapter on AI and various other things which are of interest right now. That's the frame of the book.
Well, I'm wondering if there's a book that could only be written by a journalist. Like you, I was trained in economic history, and economic history and history of economic thought. I mean, they're not quite as marginalized in the UK, but in the US, they're sort of considered fringe disciplines.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, economics is considered to be kind of ahistorical in a way.
Yeah, I've always been very critical of that. I mean, I went to Harvard for a year back in the mid-'80s after I finished my undergraduate degree in Oxford in England. And I did do I wasn't a PhD student, I was just a visiting layabout. But I did sit through a year of PhD starting classes, which were very mathematical, as you can imagine. But in those days, they did still have an economic history requirement. I think that's now gone away everywhere. And there were some excellent economic historians at places like Harvard and MIT. I really don't. I mean, I remember interviewing Paul Samuelson once, and he said the real economics is sort of economic history because that's where you put the theories to the test. But the sort of mathematization of the subject. I think the students just don't have time to do economic history now because they're too busy learning differential calculus and complex statistics. So it's become basically a applied math, I think, at the higher levels, which, I'm sort of interested in that to some extent myself. My second book, I had a sort of history of free market mathematical theories and general equilibrium theory, etc. I am interested in it, but I think it's very sort of recondite and limited sort of application to the rest of the world. And, I got to the stage, even when I got to the stage where I cover the economy. And I realized in sort of maybe the late 90s, early O's, that if you wanted to speak to an economist about what was going on in the economy and what's happening in Washington, there really wasn't much point calling up Harvard or MIT or Chicago or whatever, because the economics department would say, well, we don't really have anybody who covers that. You need to go to the business school or, you need to go to the business economists. So I think maybe there's been a backlash against that since the great financial crisis. I know there's been a lot of efforts inside various universities, especially in Europe, to make the syllabuses more relevant, more sort of real world based. But I still think at the higher levels of the subject, it's still extremely abstract.
Well, it seems like people are also interested in history and sort of, I don't know, non-orthodox thinking. Behavioral economics used to be considered that when things go wrong. Right, like when people are saying, "Hey, why is there a problem here?" That's when they take an interest in history. I know when demand for my courses in behavioral finance tend to go up or down depending on how well the markets are doing.
Yeah, no, very true. I mean, I think in the 2008-2009 financial crisis, after that, it was. I don't know how Berkeley dealt with it, but I don't see how you could. Teach just the standard finance courses and not at least touch on the sort of, the crashes and the trend following, etc., which is obviously an essential part of markets now, momentum trading, etc. But you're right. I mean, I see Columbia, and I actually did some courses at Stern in New York on finance myself 30, 40 years ago. They didn't have any behavioral economics there then, but now they seem to have at least some. So I guess that's some progress.
Well, I mean, one of the big questions in the book is what the heck is capitalism? And it seems like, people who are big fans of capitalism will sort of define out all the unpleasant stuff like slavery and imperialism. Oh, that's not really capitalism. And all the people who are very critical of capitalism will want to import all the things that, seem to be negative. I mean, it seems like a very slippery topic to define.
No, it is. I mean, obviously. And as you say, people have very strong feelings about it. I tried to adopt a broad approach here. I mean, there's obviously huge debates on, how do you define capitalism? I mean, I adopted a very sort of broad, perhaps it's an ahistorical approach that capitalism is anything involving large-scale production on the basis of privately owned assets. Private means of production. And if you adopt that broad definition, then mercantile capitalism, slavery, the plantation economies is a form of capitalism. It was large scale. It covered 3 or 4 continents, and it was for profit. And the plantations and the ships which supplied them were all privately owned. So that is a form of capitalism. It wasn't industrial capitalism. It was mainly based on exchange rather than production. A lot of the plantations themselves obviously did a lot of producing, but the East India Company and the Dutch East India Company were basically trading companies. So it was mercantile capitalism. It was what Adam Smith criticized in the Wealth of Nations. I mean, that's one of the fascinating things I found in researching this book was. That a lot of the sort of portraits we have of some of the great economic thinkers are very one-sided. So Adam Smith, of course, is always seen as the great apostle of capitalism, defender of capitalism. And when I was in Washington as a young reporter back in the 80s, covering the end of the administration, Reagan administration and the start of the Bush administration, if you were an ambitious young Republican in those days, you wore an Adam Smith badge on your lapel.
Or a tie. I remember the Adam Smith ties.
The Adam Smith Society was where to go. But if you read The Wealth of Nations, Smith actually says this book is written as a critique of mercantile capitalism and as a defense of sort of free market competition. So in his own time, Smith was a critic of the system. So that's sort of interesting. And actually, it's also true of, bringing us forward. Milton Friedman, for example, spent most of his career as an outcast from the sort of 40s to the late 60s in Chicago. When he wrote Capitalism and Freedom, which I think the original was published in 61 or 62, as I point out in my book, none of the major newspapers even reviewed it. Even the Chicago Tribune, his hometown paper, ignored it. So he was a good example of the sort of power of ideas surviving in the wilderness and waiting for the opportunity to, when a crisis. That's how economic systems change, and that's how ideas feed into it. I think mainly, they in a day-to-day basis, they perhaps don't have much impact. But when there's a crisis, people look around for new ideas. And what happened with the crisis of Keynesianism in the late 60s and early 70s, when we had inflation and rising unemployment, stagflation, people said, well, Keynesianism not working. What else is out there? And there was Milton Friedman with his hand up saying, here's monetarism, here's free market economics, which here's the legacy of Adam Smith and Friedrich Hayek, which I've been talking about for 30 years. And became an advisor to Ronald Reagan, and the rest is history. So that was an example of how ideas, I think, did have a huge impact.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason why people were so shocked in 2016 is that there was sort of a consensus, right? This neoliberal consensus that,
right.
And people like Friedman and Hayek, who were once considered fringe, were pretty much considered, mainstream, and everybody had agreed on the fundamental, tenets of free market capitalism.
Right. Well, I wouldn't say everybody, but certainly in the policy-making circles, the sort of in the international arena, the Washington Consensus, which was put together in the 80s and 90s, small government, free markets, free capital flows, deficit reduction. That was what the the Bretton Woods institutions, the Keynesian institutions, that was their doctrine that they told all the countries all around the world to follow. So it was institutionalized free market ideas. And then I think in the US and the UK, certainly the left-wing parties had become a lot more centrist. I know there was the big debate about whether they're actually neoliberal or not, but they were certainly, they dropped any sort of posture of anti-capitalism. Tony Blair in Britain famously forced the Labour Party to get rid of its Clause 4, which was a commitment to public ownership of the means of production. So they were much more friendly towards capitalism. So now, what we've seen, I mean, that's the fascinating thing about capitalism. It always throws up these sort of inner contradictions. At the same time, this consensus was emerging, the seeds were being sown for, the crisis, which was to bring down neoliberalism. But we'll see if it's brought down, but certainly caused this existential crisis it had after the great financial crisis, and then with the rise of Trump. Because if you do completely liberate markets, especially financial markets, your history suggests you're asking for trouble. And we asked for trouble, and we got a lot of it in 2007, 2009. So, but again, that's a theme which goes back to the start of capitalism. And one of the themes of the book is that a lot of the debates we have today about various issues, the roots of them can be traced back to the very early, decades of the system. It's got an inner logic which means that you can't predict what's going to happen tomorrow or the next year or whatever, but over the long term there are regular cycles, or they're irregular in length, but they recur. And the book sort of is an illustration of that, I think. I try to illustrate.
I think another theme that goes through the book is, the business about right versus left sometimes breaks down. I mean, you've got critiques from the right, you've got critiques from the left, and sometimes it's hard to tell exactly, where it would fall. So, for instance, the Luddites, I mean, are they conservatives longing for the blissful past, or are they progressives trying to, advance the cause of labor? I mean, it's not always clear whether this right-left distinction makes sense all the time.
Very true. That's very true. I mean, Luddites are a good example. I mean, they were basically I mean, it's a loaded phrase these days, but they were reactionaries. They were reacting against the economic trends of their time and trying to preserve the pre-existing system, which basically was workshop economy in the UK, was sort of descended from. There was still some feudal elements to it. The position of skilled artisans was protected. You couldn't enter the professions unless you'd done a long apprenticeship. There were all these still ancient laws on the book about, introducing new products which would challenge the position of the artisans. Most of those laws have been put in the books in the sort of 16th, 17th century, so they weren't being actively enforced at the time. And then when industrial capitalism came along, sort of technologically driven, the power loom, the steam engine, etc., and threatened to put all these artisans who basically relied on wood tools and hand power out of business. They actually appealed to the sort of pre-existing system and appealed to Parliament, saying they didn't have a vote. Britain was an oligarchy, basically. It was a very, very small franchise. So the industrial workers, the pre-industrial workers, didn't have a vote, but there was this sort of feeling of social reciprocity that they were owed something. So they appealed to their betters and sent petition down to Parliament, who completely ignored it. And it was only after they'd had their demands for some sort of help rejected that they turned to violence and started to smash up the factories and smash up the new machinery. So, I mean, I think they were, in that sense, reactionaries. But, what does that mean? I mean, does that mean we're all reactionaries now because people are worried about the impact of AI, for example, which, looks like it's going to be coming after the professional middle classes, just as the Industrial Revolution came after the pre-industrial working classes. And I think, Luddites realised, and British workers at the time realised, that the only way to sort of have any influence was to club together and, form unions. And so it did help give a spur to unionism, etc., which, is a progressive force. So there you see a reactionary, movement in some ways giving rise to progressive development. So, yeah, it's history's complicated, right? So I try to get that across in the book too.
Yeah. And also, I mean, some of the critics want to strengthen state power, right, and have more central planning, and others want to kind of scale things down, right, and
I mean,
go to these sort of communal villages and, social compacts.
That's a fascinating distinction, because originally the socialists, the left, were basically anti-state. If you go back to early 19th century Britain and France and even the US, where they sort of tried to set up self-running communities, because the state was seen as dominated by the ruling classes, which it was. It wasn't.
Yeah, they were the ones that were shooting the Luddites.
They were the ones who were sending in the troops to put down the Luddite shooting, put down the Luddite risings. So the pre-Marx socialists didn't look to the state as an agency which could help them. As you said, they saw a sort of oppressive regime. So their idea was to escape from that by setting up independent, self-governing communities. I have a chapter about William Thompson, who was an Irish laird in the 1820s, who was one of the big founders of the cooperative movement, along with Robert Owen, who set up New Harmony famously in Indiana, one of the great early experiments in communal living. So that was a sort of leftist person. But on the right, one of my other critics is Carlyle, Thomas Carlyle, the great sort of Scottish writer of the 1830s and 1840s, who was very reactionary, very conservative, but he believed in strong government. In fact, he believed in sort of absolutism. His model were the sort of German emperors and German kings.
And he's a big pro-slavery guy too.
And he was also in favor of slavery. So he saw this he didn't like capitalism. He called it the shabbiest gospel ever taught. He thought it was dehumanizing and a-religious. He had religious objections to it. So, but he was looking to sort of a strong man to come in and sort of, put the capitalists in their place. Now you may see some echoes of that in current events. So I think it was important to have Carlyle in there as a example of a critique of the sort of free market capitalism from the right, because of course that was obviously to come back very important in the early 20th century in the rise of fascism, and again in the globalized period in the rise of right-wing populism, which we now see in all over the world, including in the White House.
So another thing you see is that some of the critics of capitalism appreciate growth, right? And they want more growth. But there are others that seem to be against growth itself, right? They want to kind of put a cap on growth, and that growth itself is the problem.
Yeah, I mean, that's another thing which goes back. I mean, the early 19th century. Carlyle, for example, basically didn't believe in economic growth or didn't believe in capitalist growth. But going forward, I mean, if you take both there was a sort of consensus, I think, for a long time that growth is good. Socialism was built, Marxism and socialism, they weren't anti-growth at all. I mean,
In fact, Marx and Engels, I mean, they had a real appreciation for capitalism, right?
Totally bad growth as well. I mean, in the Marxist model of the world, socialism and then communism is only possible when we reach the stage of abundance. I mean, this term abundance, which we hear all the time now, it actually goes back to Marx and Engels, because they thought you needed a capitalist stage of a capitalist mode of production in order to create the possibilities of socialism, communism later on, when basically productivity was high enough and wages were high enough. So yeah, no, sure, they were very appreciative. If you read the Communist Manifesto, actually, which very few people do, but I did, and it's actually very interesting. The opening of the Communist Manifesto is devoted to the sort of power and technological innovations of capitalism, and actually says, the bourgeoisie have created wonders which put the sort of ancient pyramids in the shade, and done more in 100 years than mankind had done before. So that I think it was hard to live through the first half of the 19th century without seeing the sort of revolutionary potential of capitalism. There was in those days, Britain was the sort of workshop of the world. So thinkers and writers from all over the world used to visit Britain and London and then the industrial north just to see this new system emerging, much as in the early 20th century, a lot of people, a lot of left-wing and liberal people went to Russia to see the sort of new socialist thing before Stalin.
Now they come to Silicon Valley.
Now they're at Silicon Valley now, sure.
Nothing to see, really.
But China, people want to go to China to see the sort of Chinese thing. So yeah, no, so what's happened, I think, partly because of a rising inequality, but also mainly because of environmental concerns, there's been a turn against economic growth on the left. And you see the rise of the degrowth movement, which I write about in my book. Now, the way I tell that story is through the degrowth movement of the 1970s. And I tell it through the story of Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen, who was a Romanian-American economist who went to Harvard at PhD and taught at Vanderbilt for many years. And
I remember I had to read E.M. Schumacher when I was in high school.
Small is beautiful. Yeah. I've got that. He was British, but in the 70s, these debates all came to the fore after the oil price crisis, etc. And there was a famous report produced by the systems researchers at MIT, The Limits to Growth, by the Meadows. It was a whole team, but the leaders were a couple called Meadows. And that report basically made the argument that unless we sort of stopped in our tracks or came close to stopping in our tracks, the world would basically run out of resources. The argument was that the world was, reaching its maximum capacity in terms of resource exploitation. Now, turned out to be wrong, of course, and as many economists pointed out at the time, because it ignored the possibility of sort of technical progress. So there were big debates in the 70s, which sort of the economists and the sort of defenders of the system largely won. But that was, a short-term victory, you could argue. And with the rise of climate change and the associated pathologies associated with that, degrowth has made a big comeback, and not so much in the US, but in Europe and other parts of the world, it's very popular, particularly among young people who are very environmentally concerned. And Greta Thunberg, obviously, is the sort of famous spokesperson, but there are a lot of intellectuals as well who support it. And in a way, it's again, I talk about this theme of going back to the past. it is in a way a return to the ideas of the sort of original cooperative communities in the early 19th century, who sort of rejected large-scale production and were looking for sort of village-based or small community-based economies. The sort of ideal of the degrowth movement is, I think, to some extent at least, to go back to that sort of world of sort of artisanal production with very low carbon footprint. So that's definitely been a change, and of course we're having that debate to some extent in the Democratic Party now with the whole abundance movement versus the people who are on the other side of the debate.
And what's remarkable is how many of the critics of capitalism actually were involved in capitalism in one way or another. I mean, Engels, of course, is the canonical case. I mean, this guy he ran his own satanic mill, right?
Well, he was a partner in it. Yeah, his family, but in Germany, his family did run mills, and then they were partners in the one in Manchester, which he went over the Victoria Mill. It was named after Queen Victoria, and it was so successful they opened a second one. And after the 1848 revolutions in Europe, which were a whole series of revolutions, Marx and Engels at that point, they were dedicated revolutionaries from their youth, basically. They both sort of they both went to universities, radical universities, were university radicals in the sort of 1830s and 1840s, and then they moved to Paris and they were part of the revolutionary movement. But the revolution at the time, they thought 1848-49 was sort of going to be world historic and bring down all the old regimes in Europe, and of course it didn't happen. So after that, they were very disillusioned. Marx was exiled to London, and Engels decided to give up revolution, at least for a while, and go work back to the factory in Manchester where he'd worked. So for the next 20 years, he basically worked in Manchester in the factory, not on the shop floor. He was in the office, obviously, one of the managers. And Marx was in London, and Engels would send him money to support him and his family, because Marx was pretty poverty-stricken. So what Engels would do, he'd get sort of £5 notes, and he'd tear them in half and send one in one envelope and one in another. So there's no, they couldn't be stolen. So Engels basically, as I said, the profits of the Lancashire mill and the sort of, in Marxian terms, the value which was expropriated from the workers was then, some of it at least, was then shipped down to London so Marx could write Das Kapital. So that's sort of one of history's great little ironies.
Well, I mean, it seems like the biggest critique that is shared by most of the critics is related to inequality, right? And some of it, of course, is inequality within countries, but a lot of it is also inequality across countries. And so what surprised me is how big of a theme imperialism was, or international trade, or slavery, anything having to do with the global economy.
Yeah, well, I think that's probably an American's perspective. I mean, I grew up in the UK, which has always been massively integrated to the global economy. And, imports and exports were 30-40% of GDP.
I guess particularly in the Midlands, right?
And Britain's only a small island, and, it used to have an empire. So whatever else you'd learned growing up in Britain, it did give you a sort of bit of a global perspective. I remember when I came over to the US and I went to Harvard, and I remember sitting through a whole series of classes taught by an eminent professor on a monetary theory, and at the end of they were interesting, but it was all completely domestically based. So at the end of one of the lectures, I went up to the guy and said, "This is all very interesting, Professor, but what about the exchange rate? And because you change interest rates, one of the first things that happens is it impacts the exchange rate. At least that's how we looked at things in the UK." And he said, "Oh, yeah." I said, "Don't worry about that, John. We run it as a closed economy over here." And he'd advised the Fed or whatever. And I think that that was definitely the case for a long time, because imports, in those days, I think imports exports were less than 10% of GDP in the US. They're still only, I think, about 12%. So the US is a very closed economy relative to the rest of the world. So I think that's one of the reasons why it was such a huge shock in the 80s and 90s when it started to deindustrialize, and then the China shock of the early O's. Suddenly the US realized that actually we're not we're not independent at all. We are impacted massively by the global economy, and that was part of the sort of backlash which has given rise to Trump. But yeah, no, if you go back in sort of economic history, the critiques of sort of globalization go back to the early Marxists, really, who their argument was that capitalism on a domestic basis, because not most, but so much of the product goes to the capitalists, it runs into overproduction or underconsumption problems, what we'd call in modern terms deficient aggregate demand, because the capitalists can't spend all they earn so much, they can't spend it all, so the savings just sort of languish in a bank account or whatever. So the way out of that, from a sort of the inner logic of capitalism, according to the Marxists, and the British John Hobson, who I write about, who wrote a famous book about imperialism in 1902, imperialism is basically an outlet for excess capitalist reserves and new markets, etc. It's not just jingoism and racism. It's got an economic basis. And that has been a central tenet, I think, of left-wing economic thought ever since then. And to this day, it still is.
Yeah, I mean, I remember in grad school, dependency theory was sort
right,
of the...
exactly. I have a chapter on the dependency theorists as well in Latin America, from the sort of 40s to the 70s. And yeah, I mean, the argument of the dependency theorists was that basically developing economies cannot develop. That capitalism doesn't develop them, it perpetually underdevelops them. And I think there was, in the Latin American case, there was quite a lot to that. The great challenge to that view, of course, then came with the sort of rise of China and the rise of India. It's hard to make the argument now, I think, that developing countries can't integrate themselves into the world economy and grow and raise their productivity and raise their living standards, because China and India has just shown how it's done. The sort of export, I mean, basically copying the East Asian economies in the post-war era, who were the first ones to do it, Japan and Korea and Singapore, etc. That model of economic development has gone global. Again, Latin America to some extent is still a sort of outlier, but Brazil, for example, is much more integrated now into the global economy than it used to be, and has some huge, successful companies like Embraer, the aeroplane manufacturer. I mean, Trump just slapped huge tariffs on Brazil, but he left out Embraer because Americans need regional jets. I mean, that's you fly a small jet, it's likely made in either Canada or Brazil.
Well, I remember when Cardoso became prime minister of Brazil and started implementing all of these neoliberal policies. I was like, is that the same Cardoso that I remember reading?
Yeah, no, in the late 60s, he was a dependency theorist. Yeah, no, it is fascinating. It is fascinating, the history of Latin America, obviously. And, if you're talking about the history of neoliberalism, what happened in Chile with Pinochet and the Chicago boys, etc. I didn't want to retell that story at great lengths because it's been told before many times, but it is fascinating. So it is part of the book, because the last third of the book is really, I don't call it this, but it is really a sort of the rise and fall of neoliberalism, and I tell that story through sort of Hayek and Margaret Thatcher, Milton Friedman, and Ronald Reagan, the sort of rise of deregulation, and then the rise of globalization and its critics. So, yeah, I mean, that's the sort of narrative arc of the last third of my book.
Well, I think one of the themes also is how critiques of capitalism spurs the economics profession to develop, right? Like,
sure,
a lot of the theories that we now have, including mainstream Keynesianism, I mean, they all got incorporated into the general consensus, but only because of these critiques from without.
Yeah, I mean, critiques and crises. I mean, go back to what Keynesianism would never have been adopted if we hadn't had the Great Depression, and it was a response to the Great Depression.
But it's funny to think of Keynes as a critic of capitalism, right?
Yeah,
because,
well, I mean,
like Ben Bernanke would probably say, like, we're all Keynesians now, right?
Yeah, no. I mean, it's in the context of the time. Keynes was not a critic of capitalism at all. He was a great liberal, and he spent when he wasn't teaching or sort of reinventing the world, he did a lot of speculating on the stock exchange, and even in the late 20s, he lost quite a lot of money in the stock market crash of 1929. He used to speculate in currencies too. And he was a great defender of globalization. If you go back and read some of his pre-general theory works, he talks about how remarkable it is that you can sort of place orders in New York, in London in the morning, and it'll be transmitted to New York in the afternoon and to San Francisco in the evening, etc. So he was a great defender of capitalism, but he thought it had some fatal flaws. And in his view, the most fatal flaw was that it tended to get stuck in depressions. That was an inner, because it wasn't he didn't think that was the pathology. He thought that was the natural state of affairs for a capitalist economy, that once it's in recession, it doesn't have a mechanism to get out of it. Now, the classical economists of the time, the free market economists, always argued that that's not true, because prices will fall, real purchasing power will go up, and the markets will correct. The price system will work, which it always does in free market economics. Keynes said, not true at all. The prices fall, wages fall, people get poorer, things spiral down. And the only way, you need an external agency to come in and rescue things. And his external agency was the government and fiscal policy. These days, I mean, it's 100 years now nearly since the general theory. I think that's just accepted as general truth by almost everybody apart from a few free market economists. But even those free market economists, when they end up in the government, tend to adopt Keynesianism during a crisis. Even the Bush administration in 2008, acted in sort of normal Keynesian fashion. And the Trump administration during the pandemic, introduce huge stimuluses, Keynesian stimuluses. So, yeah, Keynesianism is sort of part of the institutional furniture now, even though a lot of people, some people on the right, don't like to call it Keynesianism.
Well, I've always thought it a shame that people don't continue to read the authors of the past. And, economics is one of those disciplines where, if it's not in the latest journal, you kind of don't pay any attention to it, right? And I've met plenty of my colleagues who have, never read any economists who have written before, the year 2000.
Again, I think that's crazy. I mean, it's great for me. It creates a market opportunity for me because I'm one of the guys who actually goes out and read. But I even remember when when I started doing economics back in the early 80s, they did give you the classic papers to read. You were told to read Keynes. You were told to read Milton Friedman's original papers on monetary theory from the 60s. I mean, his famous presidential address to the AEA, I think in 1968, where he introduced monetarism and the inflation and unemployment theory, attacked the Phillips curve, all that stuff. I don't really see how you can understand economic history or economics unless you're sort of if all you read is the sort of mathematized version in the latest textbook. You need the historical and institutional knowledge. And I think, I don't want to be, I am obviously a critic of the economics profession to some extent, but the really smart economists, if you go to speak to the people who get to the top, the sort of, the Ben Bernankes, the Greg Mankiws, Larry Summers, they're sort of Ivy League economists who end up running the show in Washington. They, I think, are all very interested in economic history and institutions. They realize that, you have theory and you have the real world, and the relationship between them is not necessarily straightforward. So, but I think it is true that a lot of students are just not exposed to any of this stuff anymore.
Yeah, and the other thing is,
they'll read my book and it'll fill the gap. But I mean, it seems to me it's crazy if you do a PhD in economics and you don't have to do a history of the subject part of it. Now, the reaction to that would be, well, if you do physics, you don't have to do a history of physics. But that's the problem in a nutshell, because economics isn't physics, because people aren't just particles.
Well, I mean, the other thing is that the boundaries seem to be a little blurrier in the past, right? If you look at someone like Veblen, you look at someone like Polanyi, who I remember reading Polanyi back in college. I mean, these are really incredible thinkers, but they don't necessarily slot into any particular box as, economists or sociologists or political scientists.
I think a lot of it's just the size of the university system and everything. There's such a division of labor that people specialize so early that the sort of generalists have largely disappeared. And so you get, unless the people outside the system, it's very difficult, because the professional incentives inside the economic, I mean, you know this a lot better than I do, but as far as I can see as an outsider, the professional incentives inside the profession are to specialize very early, make you master a very small area, become the greatest technical expert in that area, use the latest technical, the technical technique, new techniques, new statistical techniques or whatever to, run a study of it or illustrate it. And then, finally you get tenure and you're in your mid-30s or whatever, and you can start to think about the world. But the first 20 years or whatever, you're just sort of, you're buried inside your small furrow. I mean,
well, the other thing you notice is that there seem to be these distinctive schools, right? So remember, there's the Joan Robinson and that group of Cambridge Keynesians versus the Keynesians at the Cambridge in the U.S. And it seems like now there's just so much more mixing that you don't develop these like distinctive schools as much.
Yeah, you would know more about that than me. I think you're right. I mean, I think things have changed a lot in the last 20 years. I think given the sort of rise of sort of empirical data, both the availability of data and the sort of new techniques, the new panel data techniques and, random control testing, etc. So I think 20 or 30 years ago, the way to become famous in economics was to try and write a great new mathematical theory. It seems to me that these days, the great empiricists are known just as well. The sort of Josh Angress and the sort of labor economists and people who do random control tests in developing countries, etc. Now, maybe that's progress. I mean, there's a question about how general their findings are, of course. But you're right. I mean, that's not that doesn't lend itself to sort of ideological schools so much. It's a sort of empiricism.
Methodology.
Now, I guess Keynes would have said that was great. That was progress, because he said, we need to get to a stage where economists are like dentists. They just sort of use the techniques and plug it in. So.
Well, the other thing is, I mean, in terms of your selection, a lot of these folks are pretty obvious, right? I mean, Marx and Engels and Carlyle. I mean, these are big names, Adam Smith, but then you pick some people that I'd never heard of, really. I mean, I never heard of Anna Wheeler or Flora Tristan. I mean,
Right.
How did you decide to pick the people that you
the lesser known
picked?
people? Yeah, well, I wanted to, economics traditionally is very, very male, very Anglo-Saxon. So I wanted to broaden it out a bit. My first two books were mainly, writing about economists who were sort of white males from Europe.
Yeah.
So I wanted to spread it out a bit for a couple of reasons. One, I thought it'd just make it more interesting. But two, if I'm writing a history of capitalism, half the labor force is female. In fact, I think it's a bit more now in the US. So you have to have some women in there somewhere. Industrial Revolution, a lot of the original workers in the factories in Manchester and in New England were women. They weren't men. The men had been displaced. The employers liked women and even young girls because they were cheaper, for one thing, and they were easier to discipline. So I thought, it's got to have some women in this book. And I started out with as you said, Anna Wheeler, who was an associate of William Thompson, part of the sort of socialist movement. And then Flora Tristan, who I think is a fascinating character, was a French author from the 1830s and 1840s. And she was a sort of novelist, really, but she got interested in workers' issues and wrote a book on the workers in which she called for a sort of general union, labor unions in France. And in some ways, she was sort of a precursor of Marx. In fact, she was quite a well-to-do woman, and she used to host some salons in Paris, at which some of Marx's disciples actually attended. So it was a good narrative link between other parts of the book, but also she in herself was just very interesting, because this labor unions, is such a central part of, if you tell the story of capitalism, there's two sides to it, right? There's the capitalists and there's the unions, the labor. And the rise of labor unions is obviously a central part of sort of Anglo-Saxon capitalism, and the demise of labor unions since the 1980s has also been, I think, a central fact in the sort of economic narrative since then. And at the same time, as I said, the role of women in the workforce is just a central issue as well. So I started off with Flora Tristan and Anna Wheeler. There are other, Rosa Luxemburg is a famous name, but I actually don't think many people actually really study her works, especially her economic works. She wrote some very sort of dense book called The Accumulation of Capital, in which she sort of produced a theoretical rationale for imperialism.
I think people mostly are just familiar with her political activities.
Exactly. Yeah, I do mention that because she had such a dramatic life, obviously, and she was ended up being murdered by the Freikorps after the German Revolution. And then coming closer to our day, I have a chapter on Joan Robinson, who was a great figure in post-war Britain and sort of post-war economics, and should certainly have won the Nobel Prize for her orthodox economics, because she invented the theory of monopsony in the 1930s, and which is now a huge subject. And she wrote
monopolistic competition too, right? Didn't she?
Monopolistic competition and monopsony. She had two things. Yeah, monopolistic competition with Edward Chamberlain, who wrote the same thing in Harvard at the same time. But she also monopsony and monopoly power in the labour market. She also had a chapter on, which again is huge now. So she could have been awarded the Nobel Prize for either of those things. But she was very radical. She turned into a very radical leftist as she got older, and the powers that be in Stockholm and in the economics community just wouldn't give her it. So she was over. But she's a fascinating figure because she was sort of on the left wing of Keynesianism, and I thought it was a good way to sort of tell the post-war Keynesian story through her, because she was also involved in great theoretical debates with the American branch. You mentioned American Keynesian versus British Keynesian, the famous battle between the two Cambridges, the Cambridge Capital controversy, which is very, very recondite, but actually is sort of interesting. She had these great battles with Robert Solow and Paul Samuelson, the great American economists. So I retell some of that. And then I also have a chapter on the wages for housework movement in the 1970s, which was a sort of another angle on female work.
This was Sylvia Federici, right?
Sylvia Federici on domestic labor. A lot of women, obviously, until very recently, most of domestic labor was done by women and still is in a lot of countries. And Federici's critique and her group around her was that this should be paid, wages for housework. That was the slogan. And so I have a chapter on that too. It's very interesting because she was actually a critic. It was the rise of second wave feminism at the same time, but she was outside the orthodox labor movement and was actually very critical of it. She was, very leftist, and she thought that the orthodox feminist movement led by Gloria Steinem and people like that, Betty Friedan, wasn't critical enough of capitalism and basically propped up the system rather than critiqued it. So I have a chapter on wages for housework too. So yeah, I tried to tell some stories which haven't been told before. One of the chapters I guess I'm most proud of is a chapter on J.C. Kumarappa, who was India's chief economist.
And I didn't know about him.
I didn't really until I started looking into it. I mean, most people don't. You think of Gandhi, you don't think of economics, right? But turns out Gandhi had an economist, J.C. Kumarappa, who was a former accountant who actually trained and did a master's degree in economics and accounting in New York at Columbia back in the teens. And Gandhi recruited him to his cause, and he joined the Gandhian cause, went to jail, was jailed by the British several times. But he's interesting not just in as a way of telling the story of decolonization, but also he was sort of an early degrowth and prophet of sustainability. He was very much a defender of the village economies. He wanted to sort of organize. At the time, it was pretty clear that India was going to decolonize. British were holding on, but pretty much by their fingertips. We're talking the 1930s and 1940s. And obviously the country became independent in 1947. So there were great debates going on at the time. How should India organize its own economy? And Nehru and the Congress Party, who ended up running everything, they were very influenced by the Soviet, the Soviet example and mass collectivization, mass industrial, and not so much collectivization, but mass rapid industrialization. The 5-year plans, they introduced 5-year plans, big industry, invest in steel mills, invest in dams, etc. Kumarappa was, no, let's base it all on the village economy. We'll have a few big companies, but India should basically be based on the village economy, because he actually sounded a bit like Veblen. He said a lot of consumption is just conspicuous consumption anyway. You don't really need it. It doesn't generate welfare gains. People are actually happier. He has a famous, not famous, but he has a very interesting passage in which he compares a sort of local Indian government administrator living in his village in India in what we would call poverty, and comparing his lifestyle to a factory worker in America or in Britain. And he argues that actually the Indian was better off in real terms if you took a sort of a broad view of welfare. So that's interesting because I think one of the things which is coming back now is the whole critique of GDP as a sort of measure of welfare, and does capitalism even? Yes, it delivers a lot of growth and GDP growth, etc. But does that translate into actual welfare gains? That's obviously a huge debate now. And
Yeah, it seems like most of the critiques that you emphasize in the book are ones that are critiquing, um, the inequality and the poverty and the suffering and so forth, and much less so on sort of the cultural critiques. And maybe it's because in order to do that, you would have to double the size of the book and start incorporating a lot of fiction. So I remember, the best critiques of capitalism that I was exposed to were, in fictional form. So that's Zola or Dickens or even Disraeli. I mean, they would, write these stories which would get into the cultural life and the psychological suffering.
Sinclair Lewis and Steinbeck, etc. in American. I mean, even the late 19th century was full of novels criticizing.
Did you ever consider doing?
As I said, it's just such a huge subject. You could also say, where's the sociological, cultural arguments? I don't really have Max Weber in there. I don't sort of have the Frankfurt School. That's not because I don't think they're important or because I don't think the culture is important. It's just not my bailiwick. And this is very much sort of based on economics and capitalism, the sort of inner logic of the inner economic logic of the subject and the of the phenomenon rather, and the arguments which have arisen around there. But yeah, no, if you were doing, a comprehensive history of critiques of capitalism, as you say, by far some of the most powerful ones have been fictional and cultural, and they're probably the ones which speak to non-economists more powerfully. But this is really a book for, goes to policy and government. I think governments and policymakers have been more influenced by the economic debates than they have by the cultural debates. So I guess that would be my justification for it.
Well, look, I mean, you bring the book all the way up to the present. I mean, you've got Thomas Piketty in there and so forth. And, a lot of people think that the current political climate is potentially threatening to the longevity of capitalism. But I mean, the death of capitalism has been foretold many, many times. And it seems like it is managed to absorb those critiques and just keep on going. I mean, do you think there's anything, are the kind of critiques that we're seeing now just sort of reruns, or is there something new about the kind of critiques that we're seeing now?
Well, I mean, I think there is, as I get back to the start of our conversation, it is, I think, historically very unusual to have critiques from the right and the left at the same time. A powerful critique, obviously they're always there, but politically powerful critiques, which, represented by major parties and major political figures.
I guess we saw it in Germany in the 30s, right?
Yeah, exactly. The only historical example, not just Germany, is the Great Depression in the 1930s when there were critiques from the right and the left. And that raises the question, of course, which sort of lurks at the center of all debates now and going back to the 30s of whether capitalism and democracy are ultimately compatible. I mean, I think, sure, is capitalism going to survive? Probably it is. Is democracy going to survive? That's a different question, I think. And the way I tackle that question is by going back to, the sort of Keynes, the interwar debates, Polanyi and Keynes. Keynes's biggest argument for sort of capitalism wasn't that it was sort of morally great. In fact, he said it was very grubby and sort of based on sort of pathological propensities, greed, etc. But he basically made the argument that it delivers the bacon and not only guarantees living standards, but also maximizes freedom. he was a liberal. He was a 19th century liberal, basically. So he believed that capitalism and freedom are compatible. Karl Polanyi, the other great sort of interwar figure, had a much darker view, probably reflecting the fact that he grew up in Austria and Hungary rather than Cambridge, UK, which was, Keynes had a very privileged background, whereas Polanyi's, some of his family died in the Holocaust. So he understandably had a very dark, he'd seen fascism up close, he'd seen socialism up close in the 1920s in Vienna, and he was a big supporter of it. And then Austria went fascist, Hungary went fascist. And that sort of coloured his view that in the 1930s, he wrote papers saying that really the only possible outcome in the long term of capitalism is one of the extremes. It either goes to the socialist extreme or it goes to the fascist extreme. In the 1940s, he got a bit more optimistic about that. He was a big fan of Roosevelt, and initially he was a sort of supporter of the British post-war Labour government. So I think for a time he believed maybe there is a sort of centre way there, but he was always somewhat sceptical of it. And I think, when I was studying economics growing up, Keynes was always the great figure we studied, but I think Polanyi, in terms of sort of political constellation we're at now, you need to look at him just as closely, because that's where the great debates are, I think, not just can capitalism survive, because it's produced, we've seen 2.5 centuries, it's a very protean system. It might not survive in the current form, but there are all sorts of varieties of capitalism over the years. We went from basically managed capitalism, which is what I call Keynesianism in the post-war era, to sort of back to a sort of, much more free market vision. And both of those, came a cropper in different ways. So the question is, what's going to replace it now? And, is it some sort of democratic capitalism, or are we sort of heading for a sort of Chinese state capitalism? The US, some people argue, is now moving in that direction too. I think Polanyi is a central figure in all those debates.
Well, if nothing else, I hope your book will stimulate interest in these authors like Polanyi, fantastic authors that have been somewhat forgotten and overlooked. So thanks so much for writing this.
Oh, thanks a lot for inviting me on, Greg. Yeah, I mean, if people go back and, read, you said it yourself, nobody reads the great works. I mean, they actually get a lot out of it. They don't just rely on, if you read my book, great, read a chapter, but I would advise you to then go back and look at the sources themselves, because these people, talk about Veblen, for example, he can speak for himself much more articulately than I can in a sort of one chapter summary. Same with Keynes, same with Polanyi. So it's worth going back and, even Marx, Adam Smith, it's worth going back to the originals and seeing what they had to say for themselves.
Well, that's one of the reasons why I love, but also one of the reasons why I hate reading books like this is because it just makes my reading list that much bigger.
Well, I did try. I mean, one of the things in the book, I have relied, the main, people say, well, how can you write this? What were your sources? The main sources were the books themselves. Yeah. So I do extend, everybody I write about, including Rosa Luxemburg, even Lenin, Keynes, whoever, if I quote extensively from their works. I have my own interpretations too, but the main goal is to, actually give you an idea of what they thought.
Yeah. And also, I went back and I reread this one, and How Markets Fail. It's still a fantastic book. Everyone should go check it out.
Yeah, if you want a more narrowly economic book, I think that How Markets Fail is basically a story. It's all about the history of academic economics, really. But this is a much broader. Hopefully, is a much broader interest, because not everybody's interested in economics as a subject. But I think everybody is interested, or at least is affected by the sort of evolution of capitalism. This is the system we live in. So if you want to find out, how we got here and how people have thought about it going through the centuries, hopefully my book will, at least help you in that direction.
Well, thanks so much, John. Looking forward to the next book, and we'll talk again soon.
Thanks very much. Again, thank you very much for having me on. I enjoyed our conversation.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.